I'm Jody Schneider, Senior International Editor at Bloomberg here in Hong Kong and a member of the Professional Committee of the FCC. And it is my pleasure to introduce Vasuki Shastry, who's going to talk to us about Resurgent or Turbulent Indonesia. But first, I would want to mention that we have an upcoming event, Quiz Night, Wednesday night, right here in this space, and sign up. It will be fun. Now it is my pleasure. We are very pleased and fortunate to have with us Mr. Shastry, who is currently an Asia House board member and global head of public affairs and sustainability at Standard Chartered Bank. But we have invited him here as the author of Resurgent Indonesia, From Crisis to Confidence, for a discussion on Indonesia's future. He's going to talk to us about the battle for the heart and soul of Southeast Asia's largest nation, right now sandwiched between an inclusive politics and religious fundamentalism. A little bit of background on Mr. Shastry was a well-known business and economics journalist in India, Singapore, and Indonesia before joining the IMF in 1998. His last assignment as a journalist was in Jakarta, where he was bureau chief of the Business Times, covering the Asia financial crisis and the fall of President Suharto. He worked extensively on Indonesia during his stint at the IMF. He was Asia Pacific spokesperson and had other roles there. He also had worked for the Monetary Authority of Singapore between 2001 and 2003 as head of communications, and he's currently based in London. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Shastry. We will have question and answer afterward.
Thanks a lot, Jody. Thanks, Florence. We're delighted to be here. I was just mentioning to Jody that I came to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong for the first time in 1989, a week after Tiananmen. I think the expression parachute journalism was probably invented for someone like me. I was parachuted from Mumbai to Hong Kong to essentially get a sense of the economic impact of Tiananmen. And it was thanks to generous journalist friends here at the FCC, as well as at the Old Far Eastern Economic Review, that I was able to file a story within 5 days. Delighted to see Philip Bowring here. I'm just saying that as you age, foreign correspondents tend to be younger and younger, but Philip is someone I met in '87. And also want to pay tribute to Tony Paul, who passed away last week. Tony and I spent an eventful week in Bangkok in 1992 during the Thai military revolt. And Tony, for me, exemplified the classic foreign correspondent. His complaint after a week in Thailand was his Thai army interlocutors knew very little about Thai military and political history compared to him. And he said as he was aging, his contacts were less knowledgeable compared to him on Asia. So Tony, rest in peace. I want to talk about what motivated me to write this book. Wanted to highlight a few things that I write in the book, books on modern Indonesia, essentially going back 2 decades. So if we had to rewind 20 years, July 1998, Indonesia then was recovering from the fall of Suharto. The economy contracted by 16% that year. And there was a clear sense both in Southeast Asia as well as in Washington, D.C. I started working at the IMF. By the way, a shout out to my former IMF colleague, Steve Schwartz here. Any difficult questions on the IMF, Steve has quite kindly agreed to respond to them. There's a sense 20 years ago that Indonesia was either a failing state or a failed state, that the country would essentially go the way of Yugoslavia. Sumatra, Kalimantan were seen as too large to live under central rule. And certainly we saw the succession of East Timor in 1999. There was also the specter of famine. And it's very, very hard to think that 20 years ago, people were predicting, and these were well-known organizations and commentators who were predicting that 1 million lives or 2 million lives were going to be lost in Indonesia in 1998 because of famine, inadequate food supplies. And as it happened, and as I was fortunate enough to have had a ringside seat during the Asian financial crisis, watching the implosion of this country, Southeast Asia's largest economy. I also had the privilege working at the IMF with colleagues like Steve to really see what the path towards economic recovery looked like. And certainly in 1998, the path towards economic recovery looked a lot to people like Democratic Republic of Congo. They essentially said, you're going to see Indonesia splinter into various countries or provinces. Warlordism would return, and this country really posed a serious financial and political and economic risk to the rest of Asia. But as it happened, none of these worst fears have materialized, and that's really the core of the book. And the motivation for doing this, a book was published by Straits Times Press in Singapore. My former editor, Patrick Daniel, over the years, have complained to Patrick that a good book on Indonesia's economic transformation had not been written. And I think Patrick got sick and tired of listening to me, and at the end of the 10th year, put me in touch with the publisher of the Straits Times Press, and lo and behold, I became a published author. So the book looks at the building blocks for Indonesia's transformation. And this transformation, I must add, is still in progress, right? So this is not the case where Indonesia can simply declare victory. It's recovered to middle income status. It's in a race, not only with China and India, it's a race with countries like Vietnam. I was struck by the fact that there are more engineers that Samsung employs in Vietnam than qualified engineers you have on the ground in Indonesia today. And that should be a worrying statistic for a country as large as Indonesia. It's got very favorable demographics, but it's dependent on natural resources for far too long. And this may be the moment with commodity prices. I don't know, this is not a famous prediction, but maybe we've seen the end of the commodity super cycle, at least of the kind that we witnessed after 2000, 2001, which will enable Indonesia to wean itself away from this dependence on natural resources, perhaps build a manufacturing and services base. For a country as large and complex, Indonesia needs to create millions of new jobs every year. But to step back a minute, what really contributed to Indonesia's political stability since 1998? And I compare, so I think in 1998, after Suharto fell, Indonesia's imperfect political leaders had a clear choice. They could purge all elements of Golkar and the armed forces and the Suharto cronies. They had a clear choice. They could simply banish them away. This famously happened in Iraq when the US forces essentially purged the Ba'ath Party. And Iraq has simply not recovered from that period. So they took the pragmatic course that they would keep elements of the elite in place, and many of them are still in place, but they would fashion a democracy out of this crisis, which would have two or three very critical elements. And these are very, very simple choices that Indonesia's leadership, and I think President Habibie was ridiculed for much of his tenure. I think history is going to treat him more kindly. Because Habibie recognized, besides the issue of whether he was going to run for election once again, which the NPR put an end to his political re-election chances very quickly. Habibie made three choices, which have really placed Indonesia in very good stead. He said you needed fixed presidential terms, you needed a fully elected parliament, you needed free press, trade unions to organize, and fundamentally, Indonesia could no longer be run from Jakarta. The power had to be shared between the center and the periphery. And the periphery in Indonesia's case it's a very large periphery. Larger than Java, even though Java still accounts for 52% of the country's population. Indonesia had become too unwieldy, very difficult to manage out of Jakarta. So you had to figure out a way of sharing power with the periphery, but at the same time making sure that the country would stay together. And in the sense, you don't offer an incentive by offering full autonomy to provinces. And I think Indonesia's experiment with decentralization is a fascinating one. it really can be, it's fungible. The ideas behind that are fungible. It can really be used in other parts of the world. And it really came down to how do you share natural resources and political power in a country as complex and large as Indonesia, 17,000 islands, impossible to rule from Jakarta. So Habibie and his team, with the help, I must say, of the IMF and the World Bank at the time, took the decision that power would be devolved not to the provinces, but right down to the district level, where you had direct elections, still takes place. Indonesia had regional elections a few weeks ago, where the district governor, in effect, was responsible for delivery of social services, was responsible for political stability, and got a much larger share of the natural resource pie and overall resources from Jakarta than ever before. And so Indonesia's decentralization model, I think, was the massive down payment that the country really needed to bring about political stability. And there are many, many imperfections about decentralization. There's a tendency in many districts for district leaders to build trophy projects. But at the same time, we've seen with the successive elections at the district level that locals don't like dynastic succession. So the recent elections that were held a few weeks ago, 3 sons or uncles of provincial leaders did not win election. Which is a clear sign that Indonesians are drawing lessons from 1998. They don't want dynastic rule. And at the same time, leaders with a tendency to build these trophy projects, in many instances, have been voted out. So I would say democracy, decentralization created the conditions for successive Indonesian presidents. Indonesia has had 5 presidents since the fall of Suharto, and this is an incredibly diverse group of presidents. So you had Habibie, and mentioned Habibie, incredibly mercurial. And I think I recall one of the first meetings of the IMF team with the new president. He went into a wild rage because his pet aircraft project was not approved at the time by the fund. If this had been a different era, if this had been the Suharto era, I think Habibie could have gone ahead and simply refused international help and built his pet aircraft project. But I think the groundswell of public sentiment at that time really worked against Habibie. So he had to work within democratic principles. And this is the kind of democracy that Indonesia had witnessed for the first time, probably from the mid-1950s. So Indonesia had its own erratic, eccentric form of democracy after it became an independent country. Sukarno simply got frustrated in 1957 and introduced guided democracy, and that stayed in place until 1998. So Indonesia's experiment with democracy is unique to Southeast Asia. So you've seen at the time both Malaysia and Thailand take important steps backward, although we shall see if the Malaysian election represents a major step forward for Malaysia. And in being a country that the neighbors constantly worried about, Indonesia has suddenly been in an awkward, uncomfortable situation of the bellwether country in Southeast Asia. And the profound challenge that the country faces really is having achieved political stability. Now, how does Indonesia use this to build on economic growth? Where the results have been mixed. The Indonesian economy has grown an average of 5% over the past decade. In India, we had an old saying, the Indian economy grew 2.5% between 1955 and 1980. We called it the Hindu rate of growth. Indonesia has grown at about 5% for the last, so this is the Java rate of growth. And I think President Joko's challenge, which he has recognized, is how do you accelerate economic growth? How do you reduce dependence on natural resource revenue? And I think the President Bambang Yudhoyono years, when we look back, the remarkable 10 years of economic stability, but there's a false sense of stability because it was built on the commodity super cycle. Indonesia's challenge today really is how do you create conditions which will allow both domestic and foreign investment to come in? How do you build a manufacturing and services base that can compete not only with China and India, but also with the Vietnams of the world, rapidly coming and becoming more competitive? And at the same time, described in the book, Indonesia has to deal with 3 Cs. And the C's really are climate, corruption, and culture. And climate change does not get a lot of attention, unfortunately, within Indonesia. We've seen devastating forest fires over the years. And this mainly emanates from palm oil plantations, which have really, in the last 20 years, taken over large swaths of land in Kalimantan and Sumatra. And Indonesia, I write in the book that in terms of soft power, Indonesia cannot compete with Korea, China, and India in this part of the world. But really, Indonesia's contribution to resolving climate change, it has Borneo, which is a giant factory to capture carbon, very much like Brazil has the Amazon. Indonesia has not yet articulated what it is going to do in dealing with climate change. There's lots of international goodwill. There's the famous Norwegian deforestation project, where Norway put $1 billion on the table about 10 years ago and promised to make that payments to Indonesia based on progress in reversing deforestation. And I was struck that only 60 million of that money has actually been paid, which really shows Indonesia's got a long way. And climate is not, people who live in Southeast Asia obviously bear the brunt of these forest fires. But I think within Indonesia itself, there's a sense that there will be political and social instability, particularly in the resource-rich provinces, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Sumatra, if the leadership is not able to come to grips with climate. Corruption, I think Indonesia has got a very strong institutional framework in the form of the Anti-Corruption Commission. And I think the success of the KPI is exemplified by the desperate attempts made by several members of parliament to reduce the power and remit of the KPI. President Joko, thankfully, has resisted attempts made by parliament in reducing the remit, which really is an independent, a truly independent anti-corruption commission. It has gone after the great and the good. It has gone after the corrupt. Setia Novento, the speaker, was the most recent casualty. But I would look for signs either at the end of this term or if President Jokowi is elected for a fresh term, or indeed there's another person waiting in the wings. Any attempt to dilute the KPI, I think, would be a major step backward for Indonesia. The final C is on culture. And I think when you're in Jakarta meeting with the usual group of journalists and policymakers, you typically get the sense that the talk about Indonesia's culture, the fact that perhaps radical groups are occupying center stage. We've all seen the Jakarta governor's race last year, which is a litmus test in how far intolerance can go in the country. People within Indonesia are a little bit more complacent, a little bit more confident. It's complacency and confidence. That these are fringe groups, that the Jakarta governor's race was probably a one-off. I've been struck by the fact that the government really went after the fake news, clamped down on social media, spreading all these wild rumors. So the recent regional elections were held in a much more solid footing compared to the Jakarta governor's race. So, one can draw a little bit of, but at the same time, one should recognize that in terms of religiosity, Indonesia is a very different country. It's certainly a very different country from when I lived over 2 decades ago. And there's symbols of this, obviously more women wearing headscarves. In any office that you go down to, you have prayer rooms. That certainly did not exist over 20 years ago. But I think we should not mistake religiosity with radicalism. They're two completely different things. And the interesting thing for President Jokowi really is, having occupied the center-left stage, which really contributed to his incredible election victory in 2014. I describe it in the book as the most daring act of political entrepreneurship. We speak about President Macron, we speak about President Obama, but I think Jokowi's victory in 2014 belonged very much to the same league. Now, can he get re-elected from the centrist platform in 2019? Certainly if you look at the opinion polls, and I don't know how much stock we should place in the monthly tracking polls that we see, he's still an incredibly popular president. And General Prabowo Subianto has already indicated that he's going to be running for re-election. We shall see in the next few months if that indeed comes true. There are a couple of other candidates, and the wonderful thing about Indonesia is you've got so many more political candidates. It's greater political competition that simply did not exist in the Suharto era. And you're seeing many more political candidates from the periphery. I've been struck by the fact that the governor of West Nusa Tenggara, which is this island off Bali, which nobody, at least in my time as a journalist, ever took seriously. You have a governor of West Nusa Tenggara who really is being spoken about as either running for president or possibly being President Jokowi's running mate next year. Anies Baswedan, the new Jakarta governor, may well decide to run for presidential elections next year. Certainly President Jokowi, I think, should move or will move to the right, and you're seeing signs both on scaling back on fuel subsidies, from the comments that he's been making, that he recognizes that he needs to fight the election next year from a completely different platform. 2014 was inclusive, progressive. It really demonstrated all that was good in Indonesia. But the country has changed. And while Jokowi's got strong chances of re-election next year, I think he fundamentally will be fighting a very, very different political battle. I think I should pause here and happy to take questions.
Thanks. We'll open the floor for questions. If, as you ask a question, if you could first identify yourself and your organization. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hi, really a wonderful presentation.
Could you identify yourself?
I'm sorry, I'm Edith Terry. I'm a former journalist, independent consultant, author, different things. At any rate, and I had the privilege to grow up partly in Indonesia during the Sukarno era, which really dates me. But you mentioned how, and I also had the privilege of being in Jakarta during those days when Suharto resigned, and talking with some of the, at that time I was doing research on a book and talked with most of the kind of the senior technocrats and elite that were sort of stage managing that process. So you mentioned, the question is, you mentioned that Habibie deserves kind of to be revisited in terms of the mockery that many of his peers visited on him, as well as his reputation. I would like to suggest or ask what you think about the rehabilitation of Sukarno, because Sukarno, put in place policies of Pancasila, tolerance, religious tolerance, and led the country, back from the attack on its independence after World War II. But because of, for a long list of reasons, hardly seems recognized today as a founder of the country. So the resilience, the stability, the nationalism, the kind of inherent vision of the country as a single entity, despite its diversity, I think comes from that era. So this is just bouncing an idea off you, but what do you think of that?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mentioned in the book that Jokowi, in many ways, is early Sukarno. And if you look at Sukarno from his famous Panchashila speech in 1927 through about 1950, and that was the Sukarno who built modern Indonesia, who built the institutions. Unfortunately, Sukarno went through a radical eccentric phase between 1950 and 1966, which almost destroyed the country. But Jokowi exemplifies early Sukarno. One thing that which we have not discussed is Jokowi's virulent nationalism. That again is a throwback to the Sukarno years. I think a lot more international attention is paid on Islamic radicalization in Indonesia than it is on nationalism. And I think nationalism has made a huge comeback under Jokowi. And this recent, I see that the deal has now been done for the Indonesian government to take a majority stake in the Freeport mine in Papua. And it really demonstrates why foreign investors are reluctant to come into the country, because there is the sense that Indonesia wants essentially its assets in local hands. So I think Sukarno has made a comeback. Suharto has taken a backseat, but I think we can give both Sukarno and Suharto a lot of credit for many of their positive contributions, though it really is tragic that both had to go the way that they had to.
Yeah, question here. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tuhan Shi. I'm a freelance writer. I have two questions for Mr. Vasuki. My first question is, some people say that under the days of Suharto, you only had to bribe Suharto, but now, with democracy in Indonesia, you have to bribe a lot of local provincial officials. So, you say that Indonesia managed to avoid warlordism, but isn't there a certain amount of economic warlordism in this respect? And my second question is, how do you see the real state of relationship between President Jokowi and Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong?
Yeah, I have less insight, I would say, on the second topic, but on the first topic, I think corruption should be placed in its proper context. And this doesn't mean Indonesia gets off the hook. Certainly, if you compare India, that's a country I'm familiar with, China, do these countries have a strong either check and balance within parliament or a strong independent framework to deal with corruption? I think Indonesia really scores in having the KPI. Does this suggest in any way that corruption has been reduced? Again, anecdotal evidence, you speak to business leaders, they say that and it's probably a reflection of decentralization, that people tend to bribe less in Jakarta and bribe more in the provinces, right? So this is a reflection that this is a truly autonomous nation where a lot of decisions are taken at ground level. But there is a pressure valve, and ordinary Indonesians have exercised their electoral franchise time and again, and a lot of provincial leaders who've built these trophy statues and bridges to nowhere have lost their election. So there is a check and balance in the system, which on Indonesia-Singapore relations, I'm not an expert, again, looking at this superficially, Indonesia has made a comeback in foreign policy to an extent that even during the Suharto years, Indonesia was a very benign neighbor. But the fact that President Jokowi has now articulated policy to protect Indonesia's maritime interests, which I think is long needed for a country as geographically diverse as Indonesia. The fact that Indo-Pacific, the phrase Indo-Pacific originated not from President Trump, but it originated from the Indonesian Foreign Ministry. And Indonesia is looking at its regional interests, regional foreign policy interests, in a way that it never did for the last 50 years. The fact that part of the South China Sea was renamed the Natuna Sea shows a more aggressive Indonesia in dealing with foreign policy. But on the specific Indonesia-Singapore, I don't have any special insight.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Mark Michelson, IMA Asia. It's a peer group of executives who run multinational companies and very active in Indonesia. And when they talk about Indonesia, it divides almost half and half, maybe not quite. Half are saying it's all right, all this potential. It seems to be moving forward, especially under Jokowi and the previous president. And then the other half, disaster for some of the reasons that you described. But what I want to get to, you mentioned Joko came in, and despite what you said, which I think is right about the interests of some foreign companies, many of them were quite happy because in terms of regulation, in terms of openness, in terms of understanding a little bit what was going on, they felt more comfortable. They are feeling a little less comfortable now for some of the reasons you described, especially as we get into the election season. What do you see going forward? Saying Joko maybe does win, but will he be so restricted by what he had to give up in the campaign to win? Will some of that reform go by the wayside, and that openness that he did have, as you said, early Sukarno, will that change over time, do you think?
Yeah, I think President Joko is under a lot of pressure now to really demonstrate or to show success in the last 4 years. And I think there was a lot of good work done in the first year. Fuel subsidies, I think, is a classic example. Some of that money was used to build infrastructure. For the first time, the SBY years were remarkably stable, but President SBI did very little in terms of getting infrastructure built. So Joko deserves a lot of credit for getting some of these infrastructure projects off the ground. But we're seeing that foreign investors, if you want foreign investors to build a manufacturing plant with a 10-year, 20-year time horizon, there's a sneaky suspicion that many foreign investors have that the rules of the game is bound to change mid-course. And that's why there's a lot of pressure on the government to offer some semblance of guarantees. On the infrastructure side, there's a lot of pressure to have these first loss guarantees should the terms of the deal change. So how Joko, if he gets reelected, will use a second term, certainly will be freed, liberated from having to run for election once again. And 5% growth for Indonesia is not good enough. Country with very favorable demographics will be favorable until the year 2050, at least. Suppose you have 5 years of Jokowi with subpar economic growth, then I think the social pressures will begin to build up. So, he's got a limited window to show progress.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is John Antweiler. I'm retired. Before I was a banker and did a lot of banking in Indonesia. I have a question you touched on briefly, and I would call them the 3 R's. And those R's would be radicalism, religiosity, I've had too much wine, and racial bias. And because when I visited Indonesia, I have noticed over the years that it seems like these divisions in society are becoming wider, not shrinking. And I'm just wondering about your perspective.
In the Suharto years, I think the distinctive feature in terms of race was the Javanese were a class apart, that you could be a Muslim from Sumbawa or South Sulawesi, but you were really described as being non-Javanese. So religion really didn't matter. Fundamental change, at least that I have observed in Indonesia today, is people have a sense of identity not only about Indonesia, and I think that is Sukarno's great genius, that he was able to fashion the idea of Indonesia built on common language that really was not spoken in much of the country at the time. So I think religion clearly is an identity marker, whether you're Javanese or non-Javanese, which is very different from the Suharto years. In terms of minorities, certainly the Chinese Indonesians have made great progress thanks to President Abdul Rahman Wahid. I mean, he had a very erratic, turbulent 2-year term, but I think history will treat President Wahid very well for recognizing that there needed to be official recognition in bringing Chinese Indonesians to the mainstream. And those Chinese Indonesians are still in the mainstream, notwithstanding the backlash against Ahok last year. And I'm struck by the fact that many of the new e-commerce firms, right? So Indonesian business, you still have the old dinosaurs on one side, who've been around for a long, long period of time, who still dominate the country's business. And then you've got this new group of entrepreneurs. Tokopedia is an example, Alibaba and Tencent, major investors in Southeast Asian e-commerce led by Indonesia. So you've got this new generation of entrepreneurs, many of them educated abroad, all decided to come back to the country. Many of them are Indonesian Chinese. And if you speak to them, they have a very, very different vision and a different expectation about the country than the newspaper headlines would suggest. So it's a complex reality. I'm sure the minorities are under pressure. But until you see the kind of anti-Chinese backlash that one witnessed in the mid-1990s, I think this bodes well for Indonesia.
Hi, my name. Hello. Hi, my name is Yeni. I'm Indonesian. I'm stay-at-home mom. It's just interesting to me to hear the perspective from foreigners, and then, but one thing that is kind of struck me is you mentioned about for Indonesia will need foreign investment, and what I understand following from the local news is that we are right now just very big with nationalisms, like how we get 51% Freeport stocks in Papua, and it's everywhere in Facebook. How is that getting foreign investors going to be a good campaign for Joko to win the next term? It's just, I don't see, hi guys, I can bring Samsung here, and then it's very contradictory to hear this, and then what Jokowi wants to be supporting the local business in Indonesia.
No, I think there's a disconnect between the president's genuine nationalism, and I think it's genuine. It's not built on fake politics. I think he genuinely believes that Indonesia needs to be more self-sufficient. And I think the big lesson from 97, 98, when Indonesia was completely vulnerable, was hostage in a way to foreign forces and international institutions. I think the key takeaway for someone like Jokowi is to build national resilience and national self-sufficiency. Now, when we use the word national self-sufficiency, we return to a period of the 1950s and 60s, where a lot of Asian countries essentially believed that you need self-reliance, everything had to be built at home. So there is a disconnect between Jokowi's nationalism and the genuine desire that Indonesia needs foreign investment in order to grow. Right? If Indonesia has the capability of accelerating economic growth, you have a word with Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati. She's all about how do you get foreign investors to build infrastructure. And so there's political tension there in that, and how that, and certainly the nationalists have won in the first 4 years. Whether the nationalists are going to take a backseat during the president's second term and allow more foreign investment will to a large degree determine whether Indonesia's economic pace gets accelerated.
And we have time for one more question, Florence.
See, Philip Bowring wants to ask a question.
Okay, we'll let Philip and then Florence. Two questions.
Thank you very much, Philip Waring, columnist. You mentioned the nationalism, which is similar to that in many respects under Sukarno. Do you see in the second term Jokowi trying to promote the role of Indonesia as the leader of maritime Southeast Asia, and therefore to take his maritime defense stance to a wider sphere in a region threatened by Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, and given its traditional links with Vietnam and its common cultural ancestry with Malaysia and the Philippines?
Yeah, I think regional power projection certainly is being talked about in Indonesia today compared with any other time that I'm familiar with. But at the same time, I think Indonesia's regional power projection is going to be very different. Example, India is an example, which projects its power regionally in Southeast Asia very differently from that of Indonesia. I think the maritime strategy has been, the main takeaway from the maritime strategy is 2,000 plus foreign trawlers have been sunk, and anyone can go to YouTube and watch the choreography of these trawlers in Indonesian waters being sunk, and the language coming out of the fisheries ministry should not be seen as this is the way Indonesia is going to project its power. I don't think Indonesia is going to go its own way. It will seek to build partnerships, and I think the Indo-Pacific conception is all about partnerships, perhaps with India, perhaps with Australia, even though Australia-Indonesia relations are not very conducive at this point in time. I simply can't see a situation where Indonesia stands alone and says it is the natural regional power in Southeast Asia, and thus will project this and stand up to competitors, notably China. It's going to be a much more collaborative approach. President Jokowi is, the most frustrating thing about tracking President Jokowi is he says so few things in his speeches, right? He doesn't even bother to offer platitudes, and that's what makes him a refreshing political leader. So one can discern, reading between the lines, reading stuff coming out of the foreign minister, that Indonesia certainly has a plan to project power. What shape that will take beyond sinking foreign trawlers, we'll have to see.
Yes, Florence de Changy with Le Monde and French National Radio. About religion in Indonesia, the Islam is supposed to be very moderate. They call it Nusantara, I think, the specific of the archipelago, and they've got their own institutions like the NU, and all this makes it reassuring. Yet there are growing investments and growing influence from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Kuwait, apparently, and you do see even on very small islands like in Flores or other mosques being built by the week. People say that. So how important is this threat of radicalism in this rather moderate and peaceful Muslim country?
No, I think Islamic radicalization is for real, but whether it is in the mainstream or not. And I think this is where Indonesia's unique brand of Islam, which is completely blended with Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi philosophy and teachings. It's got a very, very powerful cultural draw amongst people, and I think it's going to be very hard to reverse. Although the number of radical Indonesians who are now fighting in the front lines of Syria, who apparently are in the thousands, what happens to them when they return to the homeland? That should be a cause of worry. But I think you still have, within the political mainstream, far-right political groups who've made an effort for the last 20 years to win more than 5 to 6% of the national vote. But every time they have failed, right? So every time they've failed. And in fact, Jokowi's election results in 2014 was a major step forward for centrist forces. And that's why he faced the backlash that he has in the last few years. So even if Jokowi, for the sake of argument, veers a little bit towards the right, selects a running mate who perhaps represents the majority view in terms of religiosity, I think that would still make Indonesia a far more moderate country than what the Islamic radicals would desire.
Well, thank you all. We'd like to give a little gift, our FCC gift.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jody.
There are books in the back, and I bet if you ask nicely, you could get our guest speaker to sign one for you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.